All right. Let me begin with a couple of announcements. The first is that the papers will be returned to you next Tuesday, so possibly Thursday, but certainly sometime next week. There will be detailed comments on the papers when you get them back, but when I return them, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the papers as well at that point in time. So I also want to let you know where we are in where we are according to the syllabus. We're about one lecture behind. So at the moment, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to cover the section called Communalism, Civil Society, and Identity. I had started talking about that in my previous lecture when I had started talking to you about identity, and I'm going to continue my discussion from there. And what you should plan to do is the reading that we have for the section having to do with voices of the oppressed, Dalit, writing, history, and politics. So that will be the lecture that we will have on Tuesday. Okay, so we're going to be about one lecture behind, but sometime around week 8 or 9, I expect to be fully back on track according to the syllabus that we have. Now, in my previous lecture to you, in my concluding remarks, I had started talking to you about identity. What is identity? And I'm going to continue that discussion. The two cases that I'm going to take up today, because what we're looking at is the subject of conflicts over identity, or sometimes what are called communal conflicts, religious conflicts. I'm going to make a distinction between communal conflict and religious conflict, but as I pointed out to you in my previous lecture, in order to be able to understand that, we need to have some understanding of what we mean when we speak about identity. So the two cases that I'm going to take up, once I've had a general discussion, are the nature of communal conflict between Hindus and Muslims. In particular, I want to look at a conflict that took place in a city called Ayodhya, which eventually led to a destruction of the mosque, what is called the Babri Masjid, in 1992. But this will be an occasion to have a broader discussion about the nature of Muslim identity in India today. The Muslims obviously constitute a significant portion of the Indian population, 13 to 14%, one of the largest Muslim populations in the world. And we know, of course, that India's neighboring states, certainly Pakistan and Bangladesh, are predominantly Muslim nations. It's worthwhile keeping in mind something that is seldom understood in the United States, or I think in most parts of the world, that South Asia, and by South Asia here I'm including India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. South Asia has the largest Muslim population in the world, effectively. Right? That outside of Indonesia, the largest Muslim countries are India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. So that will be my first case. The second case will be the Sikhs in India. It's a rather forbidding task to talk about that, for the simple reason that I'm certain that very few of you in this room know anything about who the Sikhs are. And in order to be able to understand the nature of the conflict within Sikhism and between the Sikhs and Hindus, which eventually is going to lead to the assassination of the Indian Prime Minister, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, in 1984, and a pogrom against the Sikhs in the wake of her assassination. In order to understand that, we have to know a little bit about Sikh history. So that's why I think it's a rather forbidding task, but I'm going to try to encapsulate that history as briefly as I can. To go back to the question, beginning in the broader way, broadest possible way here, about identity, I had hypothetically said to you that, look, I mean, how does one think about the identity of a person? And I think that there were some remarks that had been offered in the classroom, that identity is who you are. And then one of the things I had suggested in my closing comments is that, well, who you are is not something that is stable. The illustration that I gave to you was that if, for example, I'm in India, it would be very unlikely that if somebody asked me, who am I, that I would say I'm an Indian, because everybody there is an Indian. So, of course, at that point, it would make more sense to say I'm a Gujarati, or I'm a Punjabi, or a Bengali, or a Tamilian, whatever the nature of my sub-national identity within India. Whereas if this question was asked to me here in the United States, who am I? it would make sense for me to say I'm an Indian. Of course, I could hyphenate that identity and I could say I'm an Indian American. Or I could choose not to think of myself as an Indian at all. Let's supposing that there was a racial riot going on in the United States, and this racial riot was being directed against Indians, and somebody said to me, "Who are you?" I probably would not want to reveal that I'm an Indian, and I might simply say, "I'm an American." All right? Now that would be a very simple illustration of where I might decide that, well, I can either be viewed as an Indian, or I can be viewed as an Indian American, or I can simply be viewed as an American. If I'm traveling in Iran, for example, there it would be of advantage to me to project my Indian identity, because there's absolutely no hostility towards Indians in Iran. And in fact, I don't want to suggest by any stretch of the imagination that there's any hostility in Iran towards Americans in general. I think that if Americans went there, they would find that the Iranian people are extraordinarily hospitable. But nonetheless, given the fact that there is a, if I may put it this way, a Cold War between Iran and the United States that has been going on for over 3 decades, it would certainly be of no advantage to project my identity as an American being in Iran. But let's take another illustration. Okay? And that illustration might be of the following sort. Let's supposing that I was locked up in a room with 10 people, and all of those 10 people happened to be professional basketball players, and they were all African American, and they were all 6 feet 5 inches. Let's say that that was the average height, possibly 6 feet 8 inches, given how tall basketball players are. Okay? Now, I think that when I'm locked up in that room at that point in time with them, I think I'm not likely to think of myself in terms of whether I'm an Indian or an American. I might think of myself as having perhaps, you know, an identity which is based on my height, because every time I'm talking to one of those 10 people, I'm looking up about something like that. Right? And so at that point in time, the fact that I'm extremely short and they're extremely tall might be the most predominant thing that occurs to me about my identity. And if I happen to be locked up in a room and there happen to be 10 really attractive women there, then I might be thinking about something else about my identity altogether. The fact that I'm an Indian or an American or an Indian American, none of that might actually matter at all. And if, by the way, if my sexual orientation was the most element of my identity and I happened to be gay, and I was locked up in the room with 10 women, I might think to myself, well, you know, this is really of no advantage to me at all. Okay? So in other words, then the element of my identity that I'm thinking about or that comes to my mind is something entirely different. So what I mean to suggest by that is that when we think about identity, I think the predilection that all of us have is to immediately think of the biological givens. And I think that the first thing we have to do when we want to think about identity is to render these biological givens, the fact that I'm male or that I'm Indian American, well, that's not so much necessarily a biological given, although there's some element of that given my birth. Okay? All of these things might have to be destabilized if I'm going to start thinking productively about the question of who I am. Because if somebody asks me who I am, the first thing that would occur to me is that, well, I think of myself as a writer or a professor or intellectual, and that is the most predominant element of my identity from my perspective, but that may not, of course, appear to be the case to be an outsider. Okay? Now, keeping this in mind, what we want to do is we want to get to the question of what we mean when we speak about communal conflict in India. And in order to understand that, let me first take you back very, very briefly. I mean, this is, you know, a capsule history in 2 minutes of Islam in India. So some of you are certainly aware of the fact that Islam has been present in South Asia for over 1,000 years. In North India, Islam becomes the predominant religion of the ruling elites, of the political regimes, beginning roughly around, let's say, 1200. In some parts earlier, but certainly 1200, with what is called the Delhi Sultanate, and we know that large parts of North India, some portions of South India, but mainly North India, Central India, are going to be under what are called Muslim rulers until the coming of the British, and until the British consolidate their rule in the 19th century. Which is not to say, by the way, that all Muslim rulers of India thought of themselves only in terms of Islam, that they thought of themselves as Muslim rulers. There's no reason to presume that every ruler of India who was a Muslim thought of himself as a Muslim ruler and was administering Muslim law or the Sharia in India. There's no reason to assume that at all. But of course, these are exceedingly complex questions. The critical thing here is, when we speak about identity in India, religious identity, there is a view, and this is a view that is going to develop in colonial India, and this is a view that in India, the most crucial, critical element of a person's identity is his or her religion. Okay? That's something that you have to understand, that the colonial view of India is, so you take a person, right? We've just discussed this at some length. You take a person and we can say that the person, has a certain religious identity, they have a certain ethnic identity, a certain national identity, a certain professional identity. Right? There are dozens of ways in which a person can imagine himself or herself and think of himself or herself. The colonial view, however, was that before Vinay Lal is a professor, before he is an Indian, before he is an Indian American, before he's a male, before he is any of that, he is either a Hindu or a Muslim or a Sikh. Or, of course, a Christian, a Jew, etc., etc. But here we are only taking the 2 or 3 predominant religions. We're taking Hinduism, Sikhism, Islam. So the colonial view was that this identity, religious identity, is the primordial element of identity in India. Okay? So this much should be clear to you. And then we have to pursue what the consequences of this are. So let's supposing in the 19th century, you read about a conflict that takes place between a Hindu landlord and a Muslim landless laborer working on this Hindu landlord's farm. Now, when you read a colonial account of this conflict, the colonial account will do what? It will immediately project this as a religious conflict or a communal conflict. There is a difference. I'll tell you the difference in just a moment. It will project this, for the time being, let's just use them as synonyms. It will project this as a religious or communal conflict. Because here we have a Hindu landlord, right? Hindu landlord, and then we have a Muslim landless laborer. Landless laborer. So, what is the problem with that? Why should this view be something that we should look at with suspicion? Anybody? What might be the other? What would be the other logical way in which you could look at this conflict? Yes?
Look at what triggered it in the first place.
Okay, but what would be the analytical category? What would be the category? Instead of this being viewed as a religious conflict, it should be as what kind of conflict?
Why not a class conflict?
Class conflict. Exactly. As simple as that. Why not view this as a class conflict? Right? So if you have a capitalist and you have workers and there happens to be a rebellion, what would you likely to view it as? You would be likely to view it as a class conflict. The colonial view, however, was in India, all of these conflicts have to be first understood in religious terms, because religion is the primordial element of a person's identity. And the distinction I want to make is the following. The people who criticize the communal view, the view of colonial officials who had projected all of these as religious conflicts, the criticism of this view was that not so much that there was no religious conflict in India. Of course there was. I think it would be impossible to find a society where you did not have a certain element of religious conflict. I mean, so if you're looking at the history of Christianity and its interactions with Judaism and Islam in Europe, over a course of several centuries, it's evident that there was religious conflict. And in fact, I want to suggest to you that religious conflict was in fact far more common in Europe than it was in South Asia. Far more common. And one of the problems, of course, was that European observers, when they come to India, because their experience of the European past is that what we had in Europe was a history of religious conflict that lasted over centuries. So their disposition was to assume that what was true of Europe was true of South Asia. It was true of India. Yes?
So before colonization in India,
Yeah.
like the same conflict wouldn't be viewed as the same thing when Muslims
No. But I'm not saying that there may not be instances of Hindu-Muslim conflict. Okay? Because I'm saying to you that there is no society where such conflicts are entirely absent. But it was not the automatic default explanation. Okay? This is the difference between religious conflict and communal conflict. Communal conflict is a way of understanding Indian society where the default position is that there was always such conflict in India, and that this is the essential nature of Indian history. There's a difference between saying that yes, there are occasions when Hindus and Muslims obviously had disputes. Just as men and women might have disputes, or capitalists and workers might have disputes, or there might be disputes over 1,000 other reasons between different groups of people. Right? We don't need to have this kind of view of South Asia as a paradise where everybody was living, in absolute harmony, everything was hunky-dory. No, we don't need to project that. But on the other hand, we have to be extremely critical of the colonial view, because what the colonial view did was it took this conflict and said this is in fact the essential nature of Indian history, that Hindus and Muslims belong to two distinct nations, and there is absolutely nothing in common between the Hindus and the Muslims. So if you get a question on your exam which asks you, because remember the exam is going to be a series of essay questions. So supposing I gave you a question which said, what is the colonial view of religious conflict in India? Or alternatively, let's take a different phrasing, what is the communalist view of Indian history? So what is a communalist view of Indian history? The communalist view of Indian history is, number one, let's take it step by step. Number one, that in India, more so than in any other place in the world, a person's identity is defined predominantly by her or his religion or religious affiliation. That before a person is anything else, they could be 50 different things that they are. They could be male, as I said, they could be Indians, they could be Chinese, this and that. Before a person is any of that, that person in the Indian context is always a Hindu or a Muslim. Second step, all Hindus will naturally gravitate towards other Hindus. All Muslims will naturally gravitate towards all other Muslims. So that in fact what happens according to the communalist view of Indian history, it's not simply that religion is the predominant element of your identity. The second critical step here is that Islam and Hinduism are now both monolithic identities. The fact that there may be hundreds of differentiations within Hinduism, that a person might be a Vaishnava or a Shaivite or a Shakto, these are different ways in which you imagine yourself as a Hindu. Different sects, to use a Christian term, into which the Hindus are divided. That according to the communal view, all Hindus gravitate towards other Hindus. The fact that there are internal differentiations within Hinduism is absolutely of no consequence at all. And all Muslims gravitate towards other Muslims. And the third step then is that it is the nature of Hinduism and Islam, given that these are completely different religions from the colonial standpoint. It is a nature of Indian history that Hindus and Muslims will come into conflict with each other. Okay? That is, in essence, the communalist view of Indian history. Now, in order to, so this is the general proposition, okay? Because we're looking at, when we start to look at what is called religious conflict in India, the first obstacle we have to face is we have to ask ourselves, has this always been the nature of Indian history, which is what colonial writers thought, and which is what, for example, Mr. Gardner Harris, who writes for the New York Times, and whose piece that I had discussed with you very briefly on malnutrition in India and defecation and so forth and so on, Mr. Gardner Harris, if you look at his articles written on India over the course of the last 6 or 8 months, he automatically accepts the view that, Hindus and Muslims have been just slaughtering each other since the beginning of time. Right? Effectively, that's a view that he really adopts. And this is what, of course, you would call the communal view of Indian history. So when we look at a religious conflict, because we don't want to avoid the subject, we don't want to say that, well, this is an aberration. Religious conflicts really never take place. They're only instigated by people for political purposes, so forth and so on. And there might be something to be said about that too, but we'll get to that momentarily. So what we're interested now is two conflicts, and one is a conflict over a mosque called the Babri Masjid, which was built by the Emperor Babur in 1526. The Emperor Babur is the one who initiates what is called the Mughal Empire, what eventually becomes the Mughal Empire in North India, the grandest empire of its kind, certainly in those days. Okay, and this mosque is built in a town called Ayodhya. And what is Ayodhya? Ayodhya is a town in North India, and it is also the place which is identified in the Indian epic, the Ramayana, as a place where possibly, I say possibly, Ram, Lord Ram, was born. Okay? And Ram is one of the major Indian deities, right? So this is, there are many Indian deities, of course. Ram is one of the major Indian deities. So Ayodhya is a place, although there is some dispute among historians whether the Ayodhya mentioned in the Ramayana, okay, in the Indian epic, the Ramayana, is in fact the same Ayodhya where this particular mosque was built in 1526. I'm going to say that for the sake of convenience, let's assume that it is in fact the same town that is mentioned in the epic and where this particular mosque was built in 1526. Now, in order to understand this conflict, let's just look at one slide over here, chronology of an epic dispute. So you will notice so it says 1528 here, 1526, 1528, Babri Masjid was built. And then you notice that there is a gap of 330 years before you get the next date in this chronology. Okay? It's a significant gap because effectively nothing is happening. Nothing is effectively happening, and in fact, even in 1859, it says British built fences to separate Hindu and Muslim areas of worship. And somebody here might say, well, how did we get to a Hindu place of worship if there's a mosque here? So now let's understand what the dispute is about. The dispute arose fundamentally 30 years ago, not in the 19th century. Okay? There was a bit of a tiff in the 1850s. And why did the dispute arise? Because Hindu nationalists started to argue that this mosque was built on the same spot where stood a Hindu temple. Okay? And if we had said nothing more than except this, we would say, well, what's so exceptional about that? Because that is effectively the history of what is called spoliage in most countries in the world. And what I mean by spoliage, has anybody here been to Istanbul? I'm sure there are a couple of you here who probably have been to Istanbul, but you know that in Istanbul there is the Santa Sofia. Okay, and if you know that this is one of the most venerable religious institutions, buildings in the world. And one of the things that's happened to the Santa Sofia or the Hagia Sophia is that it traded hands. That when the Christians were in power, it was a church. When the Muslims were in power, they would convert it into a mosque. When it went back to Christian hands, it was reconverted back to a church. Now, what is it that typically invaders do? They level a religious building. That's the politics of conquest. They level a religious building, and then in order to signify the greatness of their own religion, they build a religious edifice representing their faith on the same spot. And I'm not saying, of course, that that's justifiable. I hope that nobody's inferring me to say that I think that that's a great thing. I'm just saying that this is, in fact, how the politics of conquest, in fact, actually takes place. So I think we can certainly accept that the Emperor Babur built a mosque. Now, whether he destroyed a temple that actually stood on the same spot or not is somewhat disputed, but I'm willing to say, well, let's allow them that. Let's accept the fact that he probably destroyed a temple. Of course, he destroyed 5,000 other temples too, perhaps. So the question is, what is so special about this temple? What's so special about this temple, according to the Hindu nationalist view, is that this temple that was destroyed by the Emperor Babur, or by minions and soldiers working at his orders, of course, what was special about that temple was that this temple stood on the exact spot where Lord Ram was born. Okay, so it was a special temple. And therefore, according to the Hindu nationalist view, this mosque is the eternal reminder of the desecration of the Hindu faith by the Muslims. And therefore, the demand became, in the 20th century, because notice that even in 1859, and we're not going to go through every step of the chronology here, but you'll notice 1859 and then the next is 1950, 1949. In the 20th century, after independence, 1947 is when India becomes free. Right? After independence, the Hindu nationalists are going to demand that this mosque be removed. Okay, and of course, the Muslims said that that's impossible. That's a complete desecration of the mosque. You cannot remove a mosque just like that. And in fact, even in 1949, effectively, it's going to be only really, if you notice 61 and then you have 1984, you have again a big gap here. It's going to be again 2-3 decades before this demand is revived. Okay? So now I want to go back to the previous slide. I want to take on a few questions that you understand, and I want to tell you what the aftermath is so that you can then go back. The aftermath of this is that going to be in the 1980s, there's going to be this burgeoning demand. It's going to continue to grow for the removal of the mosque. The Indian government, of course, because officially what is India? It's a secular republic, right? It's a secular republic, which means that the country is sworn to defend every religion. And all the religious minorities are in principle given protection. And that means that their religious edifices are given protection. Right? So this demand is going to continue to grow. The Indian government, of course, cannot agree to such a demand. And eventually what the Hindu nationalists are going to do is they're going to take matters into their own hands. And on 6th December 1992, a crowd of over 20,000 Hindus is simply going to take over the mosque. They're going to climb on top of it and they're going to take it apart brick by brick. And in the aftermath of that, you're going to have a bloodbath. Right? This is the religious conflict that we're talking about. There are going to be several hundred people who are going to be killed across India because there's going to be, of course, huge outcry, resentment among Muslims because their mosque has been desecrated, and then the Hindu nationalist response once again. So, but in order to understand that, I think that we have to understand a couple of other elements. Okay? The first question to be asked here is, how is it that the Hindus became so interested in this particular spot, given that it was built in 1528, and that until the 20th century effectively, there was no interest at all. And of course the Hindu nationalists have a response. The Hindu nationalist response is that, well, that Ayodhya was part of Uttar Pradesh, okay, what is now called the state of Uttar Pradesh, but that part of the country continued to be under Muslim rule until the British become the predominant rulers, become the paramount power. And then when the British became the paramount power, the Hindus again really had no way in which they could impress upon the colonial government that there was some necessity of doing something here. So the Hindu nationalist response would be that as soon as India becomes free, and India is now in a position, right, and India here meaning Hindu India, although of course you have to remember that India is a secular country, because India is not equivalent to Pakistan in that sense, which is going to be a predominantly Muslim country, overwhelmingly Muslim country, and in the case of India, as we have seen in previous lectures, that is not really the case. But the Hindu nationalist response was that, well, what we have to do is we have to be able to put pressure on the Indian government to be able to do something about this mosque, and that in the aftermath of 1947, it becomes possible to do that because now Indians are in control of their own destiny. Right? This is the Hindu nationalist response. And frankly, even that response is not adequate, as I'm going to try to point out to you. Okay, so the Hindu nationalist view I've already indicated to you is that this is not just a mosque that was built on a particular spot here. It's not just a random Muslim religious institution. It is a mosque that was built to humiliate the Hindus because it was built at the exact spot where Lord Ram was born, one of the greatest Hindu deities. Okay? Now, one of the very interesting problems that this raises is what I'm calling the invocation to history. Because one of the things you have to understand about Hinduism, something that I've mentioned only in passing, and which is difficult to convey because we're not doing here a class on religion, we're not doing a class on what is the nature of Hinduism and what exactly distinguishes it from Islam. But one of the things you have to keep in mind is that Hinduism is indeed quite different from Islam in some fundamental respects. And one of the fundamental respects in which it is different from Islam, and in fact from the Abrahamic faiths. So when I say the Abrahamic faiths, I mean obviously Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. That one of the ways in which it's different from these Abrahamic or Semitic faiths is precisely the fact that Hinduism is an extraordinarily decentralized religion. Extraordinarily decentralized. So unlike, for example, the Muslims who have one single holy book, the Quran, or the Christians for whom the Bible is all important, there is no equivalent text in Hinduism. There is no Mecca for Hinduism. By which I don't mean to say, by the way, that the Hindus don't have their pilgrimage sites. They've got hundreds of pilgrimage sites. There is nothing which has the same centrality that Mecca has in Islam. There is nothing comparable to that really in Hinduism. Okay, and I could keep on giving you hundreds of such illustrations, but this is what I mean when I say that Hinduism is a highly decentralized faith, and most strikingly, it does not have a historical founder. Right? So Christianity has a historical founder. Christ, of course. Islam has a historical founder, Muhammad. But Hinduism does not have a historical founder. And in fact, the critical element of the story here is that Hindus for centuries, possibly for 2-3 millennia, if we want to put it that way, were never interested in historicizing their religion. Okay? The idea that you would have to now think of Hinduism as a historical religion with a historical founder, with a certain book which becomes singularly important for all Hindus, all of this is completely foreign and alien to Hinduism. So what is going to happen fundamentally in the 19th century, beginning in the 19th century under colonial rule, is a turn towards this historical way of thinking about your own religion. Why did that turn take place? It took place because for Indian nationalists, the fundamental question in the 19th century was, why is it that we Indians, and mainly Hindus in this case, these are the Hindu Indian nationalists who are thinking that way, why is it that we as a people have always been colonized by others? Why have we always been colonized by others? And I want to give you, and in order to spell that out, I want to give you an illustration of an argument made by an Indian writer and major Indian nationalist known as Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. Okay, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. You will sometimes see his name as Bankim Chattopadhyay. That's simply the Chatterjee is the anglicized form of Chattopadhyay. This is the most common form in which his name is going to be encountered. Bankim Chandra, first name, Chatterjee, surname. He's an Indian writer and nationalist writing in the second half of the 19th century. So one of the books that he's going to write is a book which is called Krishna Charitro, and Krishna Charitro means the life of Krishna. Now, for those of you who have some familiarity with Hinduism, you might immediately think to yourself, how do you write the biography of a mythical figure? Okay? Because who is Krishna? Krishna is like Ram. He's an Indian deity. But he's not a historical figure. He's not the founder of a religion, the historical founder of a religion. Okay? So for Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, he's going to write the biography. It would be like writing, well, this is not really an analogy. No, I shouldn't probably say it's like writing a biography of Mickey Mouse, but it might be a little bit like that in the sense that you have to now start thinking about how do you actually write the biography and imagine that person to be a historical founder. Let's just wait for it. Okay. How do you imagine that person to be the historical founder of a religion? Now, for Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, you understand the relationship between this biography, when I explain to you what he's doing, and what the problem is for us. Because remember what the problem is. The problem is that Hinduism is being radically transformed, or there is an attempt to radically transform it, turn it into a Semitic faith. Make it look more like a Semitic faith. And to make it look more like a Semitic faith, it needs to have a historical founder, it needs to have one single book, right? It needs to look a lot more like Christianity or Islam. So what is Bankim Chandra Chatterjee going to do? He's going to take the figure of Krishna. Usually in most texts you will see the name written this way, Krishna. Krishna is a Hindu god. Now, there are two ways in which this Hindu god has been represented in the Indian tradition. Okay? The first way, and if there's occasion for it, I will, in the Hindi film section, because I'm going to look at popular culture, I'll show you some of the popular images of Krishna. So I think that you will understand at that point. The first and predominant way in which Krishna has been shown, and remember, Krishna is a god. Krishna has been shown in Hindu paintings, the way he's been represented in texts, the way that songs have been composed about him, is to show him as a god living in an idyllic world. Okay? And what is this idyllic world? It's a highly pastoralist world. And Krishna basically is somebody who amuses himself. And there are lots of ways in which he amuses himself. Right? So he's a lovable god, a playful god. So as a child, for example, he's extremely fond of butter, and his mother is constantly hiding the butter. Right? So he's called the butter thief. So if you look at Hindu texts, you know, makhan chor. Makhan chor is a phrase in Indian languages, North Indian languages, for this Krishna. And remember, we're talking about God here. Okay? We're not talking about just a little boy who's playing some pranks in the house, as boys or girls often might do when they're little children. He's a god. Okay? And he loves to play in the mud. And one of the episodes that's very often described in the Hindu text is that his mother Yashodhara, she gets very angry because he's constantly playing in the mud. And so one day she goes to him and she yanks open his mouth and says, have you put mud in the mouth? And then when he opens his mouth, what does she see? She sees the whole world, the whole universe within it. And then she comes to the realization, oh, he's not just my son, he's also God. Now, one of Krishna's favorite activities, okay, and you can imagine the kind of anguish that Bankim Chandra Chatterjee and Indian nationalists are going to go through when I tell you what this anecdote is, because I'll explain to you the meaning of that anecdote. So one of Krishna's favorite activities is that in the place where he's supposed to have been born, this mythical place, if I may put it this way, I mean, there's actually a town called Mathura where he's supposed to have been born, but as I said, of course, there isn't any reason to think at all, and no Hindu ever thought that Krishna was actually a historical figure. Okay, keep that in mind. So in the town of Mathura, which is on the banks of the river Yamuna, one of Krishna's favorite activities was to go by the river, when young women, known as gopis, were taking a bath in the river. And before they've taken a bath in the river, they've taken off their clothes, they put them in a little heap on the banks of the river, and what does Krishna do? He walks by, he picks up these clothes, and then he goes on top of a tree. Now, when the women have finished their bath, and they're about to emerge from the river, they realize that their clothes aren't there. And then Krishna whistles from the top of a tree and says, if you want your clothes, come get them. But of course, they're naked. They're not going to just step out of the river. Right? And Krishna says, well, if you want your clothes, you come and get them. And of course, the religious writers are going to say that this is all allegorical. Why is it allegorical? It's allegorical because the idea is that a devotee should appear before God naked. I don't mean literally, of course, metaphorically. That is that it's like confession, right? What do you do when you're a Catholic and you still do confession? You lay bare yourself. Say exactly what it is that you've done wrong. Now, you cannot have an ego as a devotee. What is it that prevents us from being the perfect devotee of God? The fact that we still have an ego. Right? And so this is an allegorical parable, okay, about the relationship between devotees to their God. Now, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee is agonized because he says, what kind of God is this? Right? I mean, he goes around meandering around the village. He's got supposedly Krishna had 16,000 lovers. Okay? He's got 16,000 lovers, right? He engages in pranks. If we want a God, he should look and act a little bit like Christ or Muhammad. He should be stern. He should be a punishing God, not this kind of playful, frivolous character. Okay? So for Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, this is the problem, that we don't have a rational historical religion. And what he's going to do in this book, Krishna Charitra, he's going to suggest that there is a second tradition of Krishna. Right? And this is a more historical Krishna, a Krishna who acts more like the kind of God that you recognize in a Semitic faith. I know that this is a fairly complex matter that I'm talking about here, but I'm trying to suggest to you that if you want to understand this particular conflict that took place that eventually started taking place in the 70s, going into the 80s, and eventually led to the destruction of the mosque, it will not be sufficient to describe it simply as a communal conflict. In fact, it would be highly inaccurate in some respects to describe it as a communal conflict, which does not mean that there was not a religious element in this conflict. Because, of course, one of the things that's happened over a long period of time is that some Hindus and some Muslims, not all Hindus, not all Muslims, but some Hindus and some Muslims have begun to think of themselves indeed predominantly in religious terms, right? Which is, of course, the case with some Christians. And that's the rise of Christian fundamentalism in countries such as the United States, where people begin to think of themselves predominantly as Christians of a certain stripe. So, in this particular case, one of the things that aggravated the conflict considerably is the fact that this invocation to history meant that this religion called Hinduism, which was a profoundly ahistorical religion, and in fact had been the basis of that strength of that religion was precisely its ahistoricism, that this ahistorical religion is now sought to be transformed, a process that goes back to the mid-19th century, okay, when colonialism becomes, in fact, the dominant political paradigm, right? And Indian nationalists begin to think, well, why is it that we have been colonized as a people? And so the Hindu nationalist response is to say that what we need to do is we need to, in fact, actually reformulate our identities. We need to, in fact, now have a Hinduism that is much more of a modern religion. A religion that begins to look more like Christianity and Islam. Now, this was something that was not easy to perform, partly because the Hindu nationalists, after the assassination of Gandhi in 1948, essentially were banished. Because the assassin of Mahatma Gandhi, and I know that half of you at least wrote your paper on that particular subject, right? At least half of you in this class wrote your paper on that. that, as you know from reading that piece itself, that of course Gandhi's assassin was somebody who was an Orthodox Hindu, right? An Orthodox Hindu. And so one of the consequences of the assassination was the Indian government immediately banned the RSS. The RSS is the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. Okay, so it's a Hindu paramilitary group. It's a Hindu paramilitary group. And now, of course, it's become exceedingly important with the rise of Narendra Modi as Prime Minister of India. So the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha, which are two Hindu nationalist organizations, are going to be under the radar screen of the Indian government after the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi in January 1948, and they're going to be banned for a short period of time. And so this banning means that they actually are banished into the wilderness. And it's going to be a couple of decades before they start to resurface back. Of course, it's not as if they were doing nothing in the 1950s and 60s, but effectively, from the point of view of the narrative that we are interested in the 1970s, the RSS is going to start to come back, and you're going to have a political party called the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP. So India's current Prime Minister is now a person who belongs to this party, the BJP. And just to give you an idea of how extraordinarily swift has been the rise of the BJP, in 1984, when the BJP competed in Indian elections, they won 2 seats out of 535. 2 seats in the Indian Parliament. Now they command an overwhelming majority. Overwhelming majority, well over 350. And this is 30 years later. Okay? So one of the things that we have seen in India, consequently, is the rise of the BJP, the rise of a Hindu nationalist party. Of course, the BJP claims to be not just a Hindu nationalist party, they also claim to be a secular party. And we're going to address that question later on when we look once again briefly at the question of secularism in India. So when I say the movement to liberate Ayodhya, what do I mean by that? That the Hindu nationalists said that, well, Ayodhya has to be liberated. It has to be liberated from Muslim rule, and the only way you can liberate Ayodhya, which is a city of Ram, a great Hindu deity, the only way you can liberate Ayodhya is to, in fact, remove the most visible sign of the humiliation of the Hindus. And what is the most visible sign of the humiliation of the Hindus? It's the Babri Masjid. So finally, as I said, on 6th December 1992, the Babri Masjid is going to be destroyed. And it's going to be destroyed notwithstanding the fact that the Indian government had put a huge security force around it. Right? So how did the destruction of the mosque take place? How was it possible? And the answer is obviously the fact that the Indian state was complicit in the destruction of the mosque. Okay, so this is a very famous photograph, okay, of the destruction of the mosque. So you can see all of these people who have risen to the top, and then eventually what they're going to do, you know, we'd have to see a whole series of slides. They're going to reduce it to rubble. Absolute rubble. It's just going to be taken apart not with a bulldozer. It's just going to be taken apart by people using picks and shovels and axes, and they're just going to break it, and it's going to crumble. Okay? A mosque that goes back to 1526. So of course, for many people on the left and many people who are on the secular side of history, as it were, this was the darkest moment, as they would often say, in Indian history since 1947. Now, in the aftermath of this, you're going to have conflicts. You're going to have rioting. There's going to be widespread rioting in North India, mainly in North India, a little bit in South India, mainly in North India. It's going to continue for a period of time. And we're going back to 1992, leading into early 1993. Now we're at a point now which is 20 years after that. And very briefly, what I want to do is I want to describe to you what are some of the problems for considering the question of Muslim identity in India. There has long been a feeling among Hindus, and when I say long been a feeling of this kind, I mean in the post-1947 period, and particularly in the last 3 decades, there's been a feeling that the Muslims in India do not think of themselves as Indians first. Okay? That they're not loyal enough to the Indian nation state, because in Islam, the idea of the Ummah, the worldwide Muslim community, is something that commands their allegiance. Right? And this is a question, by the way, that comes up very often with Muslims in the United States. And of course, I think that it's a feeling that needs to be checked. It's something that needs to be interrogated very seriously. And of course, for many Indians, especially middle-class Hindus, the real test is what happens in a cricket match. So when you have a cricket match, because for those of you who have the slightest inkling of South Asia, you know that there's something called religion, and then there's something called Bollywood, which is another religion, and then there's a third religion, and that's called cricket. Okay? Right? There are various religions in South Asia. And cricket is a real religion for many people. And so when a cricket match takes place between India and Pakistan, the middle-class Hindus especially are watching. Okay? They're watching the Muslims in India. Who are the Muslims going to support? Are they supporting India? Are they supporting Pakistan? For them, this is a litmus test. Very simple litmus test for them. Right? So if they see, for example, a flag of Pakistan, or if they see any sign of a green, green is a color often associated with Islam, they'll immediately say that, well, these people are not rooting for India. Okay? So there's this perennial suspicion about Muslim loyalties towards India. Now, we don't have time to, obviously, because in fact I'm doing a course right now. The other course I'm doing is Politics of Religion in Modern South Asia. So we're looking at some of these questions in much greater detail. And I don't have time to now tell you the whole history of what has happened with Muslims in India in the post-1947 period. But what I do want to say is really the following. I think there is no question that if you look at socio-economic data in India, there is no question that Muslims are comparatively doing poorly in comparison to, for example, other groups such as Hindus. They are doing poorly. So, and when I say poorly, you have to look at hundreds of different indices and facts. To what extent are they integrated into the Indian economy? To what extent are they integrated into the social fabric of life in India? So there's an anthropologist who did a study about 8 or 10 years ago, looked at the 10 leading private schools in New Delhi, in the capital. Okay? And New Delhi has a population of about 20 million right now. And when I say private in India, they're called public because this is the English usage. So an English public school means a private school. Okay? So they looked at the 10 leading public schools in the city of New Delhi, and they found that these schools were overwhelmingly upper caste Hindus. 99% in some cases. Yeah, there was one or two Muslims sprinkled here and there in these schools. Right? And so what, of course, the study was trying to show was that, in fact, the Muslims are not integrated into the social fabric of Indian life. And of course, there are different ways to argue that. There are different ways to argue it, because you can say that, well, to what extent do Hindus and Muslims intermarry? And I can give you the answer, very seldom. Yes, there are people who are going to do that, of course. But if you're looking at it as a statistical measure, the rate of intermarriage is very low. How common would it be to find Muslim, Hindu, upper caste educated Hindu to have Muslim friends? The likelihood is not very great. Right? Unless that person explicitly holds to a secular worldview. And there is a committee that came out. It's called the Sanchar Committee. This is a government committee, and they conducted a massive study of the position of the Muslim in Indian society today. And this study, I think, shows quite decisively that in most of the major areas of life, such as, for example, to what extent do Muslims have university degrees? Right? To what extent do they have upper-level government jobs, upper-level corporate jobs, so forth and so on? You find that the Muslims are lagging behind considerably. And some of these problems, I have to say, are problems that go back to the 19th century. These are not problems that all of which originated in post-1947 India. And they have to do, to some extent, with the insularity of the Muslim community itself. Because one of the things that this committee report found out, and many others who have studied this problem, is that the Muslims themselves tend to be relatively more insular. So it's a circular problem, because they tend to be more insular, they're less integrated. They're less integrated, and therefore they react by becoming more insular. Okay, it's a circular problem to some degree, and one of the reasons for this, as I said, is that in the 19th century, when in 1857, 1858, you had the biggest revolt thus far against colonial rule, which was going to be crushed by the colonial government. The colonial government took the view that the Muslims were largely responsible for it. So the Muslims had to face the burden of the punishments imposed by the colonial state in the mid-19th century. And this insularity, because that's very often what defeated people do in this instance, you become more insular. You withdraw into yourself. And of course there are other reasons. Some people have pointed to, very controversial. I don't really have time for discussing them, such as the fact that there's been an argument, and I think that one would have to assess this argument in great detail before one can agree with it or disagree with it. But the argument that Muslims are reluctant to send their children, especially female children, to secular public schools, so forth and so on. But what this committee report indicates very clearly is that the socio-economic integration of Muslims in India has not really taken place to the extent that one would consider it to be desirable. All right? And when I say integration, I don't mean that, of course, that you abandon your personality as a Muslim, or that you leave Islam behind. Of course not. It means integration, that is that you have a full place in that society as a Muslim, as an observing Muslim, if indeed that is what you are. Okay? So this is, as I said, a very brief survey of this question. The question of religious conflict continues to animate a great many people. But one thing I have to tell you, I mean, this is one way in which you have to put facts in juxtaposition. That if you read a New York Times article and it tells you, oh, these people have been slaughtering each other for, thousands of years or hundreds of years. Well, not thousands, because Islam only began about 1400 years ago, but for hundreds of years. Right? How many people were killed in religious conflicts in India, for example, in 2013? The answer is fewer than 1,000. And how many people were killed on the streets of Chicago alone in acts of homicide? Over 2,000. Okay? 25,000, 30,000 gun-related deaths in the United States every year. So that's one way in which you put these facts in juxtaposition and then say, well, what do we really mean when we talk about religious conflict in India? Because I think if the question was, how does one understand the place of a religious minority in that society, I think that is a much more intelligent and interesting way of trying to understand how one looks at relationships between members of different religious communities. And finally, in 2002, there is a pogrom. And you know what a pogrom is. A pogrom is state-incited violence against a group of people. Okay? There is a pogrom against Muslims in the state of Gujarat in 2002. The person who was the chief minister of Gujarat at that time is now the Prime Minister of India. And I think there is no question whatsoever, and that is one of the reasons I gave you that report, not this week's reading, but previous week's reading, one of the previous week's reading, and it's a report by Amnesty and Human Rights Watch. I mean, there are lots of Indian groups that have done exactly the same thing. But I didn't give you the report of an Indian group, I gave you the report of an international group, so that one wouldn't think that, well, the Indians are partial about how they're writing about some of these things. But what this report shows very clearly is that there was state complicity. And when I say state complicity, what I mean is that when a conflict arose and Muslims were being deliberately targeted by members of the Hindu community, the state simply looked on and did absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. There's no question in my mind that there was massive complicity on the part of the Indian state in Gujarat in 2002. I think there are dozens of reports that have established this beyond the shadow of a doubt. To what extent particular individuals were responsible or not is a different question. And I also have to say, going back to a comment I made earlier in the class, and I'm going to conclude the discussion of this question with that comment, I also have to say that many of these communal conflicts or riots are in fact actually not simply state incited. These are manufactured. So there's a political scientist who has worked on India for 40 years. His name is Paul Brass. You have a short excerpt from one of his books in week 1. Okay, so Paul Brass has spent his whole life basically trying to understand communal rights in India. And he has come up with a phrase which I agree with, and he calls it an institutionalized riot system. That's his phrase, institutionalized riot system. There are people who are actually specialists whose job is to promote communal conflict. That's what they do. So for example, my profession is I'm a professor. There's someone whose profession is an actor or a plumber. Well, their profession is they are institutionalized riot specialists. That's what they do, effectively. So you want to engineer a riot, you belong to the BJP party or you belong to the Congress party or any other party, you want to instigate communal conflict for political purposes. You want to mobilize people in your own community. You want to instigate them against members of another religious community. What do? You go to these institutionalized rights specialists and say, engineer a disturbance in this area. And when these killings took place, because I want to suggest to you, it's not simply a matter of, people get enraged and inflamed and then they go about killing others. When these killings took place in 2002, many of the neighborhoods in which these killings took place are highly integrated. So you have a Hindu shop, Muslim shop. When I say Hindu shop, I mean Hindu-owned shop, of course, that the owner is a Hindu. Shop next to it, owner is a Muslim. Shop next to it, owner is a Hindu. When these riots took place, only the Muslim-owned shop would be burnt. How did the rioters know that? How do you know it? Unless, of course, the person explicitly, advertises himself in some ways. Okay? The way you know it is you go to the municipality records and you find out. And in order for you to do that, there have to be people in the state government, in the municipal government, who are willing to give that information to you. We have actual transcripts of telephone conversations, believe it or not, in 2002, actual transcripts where one of these mafia men who's orchestrating a little communal conflict in this place, he actually calls his henchmen and says, this area is too quiet. There's so many Muslims here, but nothing's happened here. I want you to bring a truckload of men here and burn a few places and kill a few people. We actually have transcripts of people calling, using their cell phone. This is also what I call the first cell phone pogrom in the world. Okay, 2002, everything is orchestrated through the cell phone. You just make these calls and say, come here, okay, and burn these shops down, kill these people. We just don't have enough activity going on in this area. That's what they would say. So this is what we are really speaking about when we're talking about communal conflict. And the same thing happened, and this leads me to my second example. Okay, so the same thing happens in 1984. I'm going to begin again with the aftermath, and then I'm going to go back. I'm not going to be able to finish the whole discussion here, but I'm going to be able to give you at least something of it. And we'll spend about 10-15 minutes in the next class before we turn to the question of caste politics and Dalit identity. So in 1984, the Indian Prime Minister is going to be assassinated, Mrs. Indira Gandhi. So she's going to be assassinated by two of her own Sikh bodyguards. Okay? And when she's assassinated, in the streets of Delhi, the capital, so you would have to think about something comparable happening in Washington, let's say. In the streets of Delhi, in the aftermath of her assassination, because her assassins were Sikhs, Sikhs were dragged out of their homes, many of them, and just burnt alive on the street itself. And it is estimated that 2,000 to 2,500 Sikhs were killed in 3 days in Delhi before the state acted to put it down. And when I say the state acted to put it down, I mean the state had to send armored divisions, they had to send the army and say, anybody found committing acts of arson or killing is going to be shot on the spot. And you impose, of course, a curfew. That's the way you control it. Of course, the question is, why did it get to that point? Why did the state even permit something like this to happen? Did the state permit it to happen or not? Of course, the ruling party at that time was not the BJP. So that's what I want to make sure that you understand. That this is not simply a matter of Hindu nationalists doing it. This was the Indian National Congress party, the so-called secular party whose history goes back to 1885, the party that was led by Mahatma Gandhi for 25 years. So the ruling party at that time in 1984 was the Congress party. And Indira Gandhi was the head of that party, the Prime Minister of India. And the response of the Indian National Congress Party when these allegations that the state did nothing, in fact it was complicit, they said, well, people are inflamed because the Prime Minister has been shot dead. She's been assassinated. And we can't control this. Of course they can control it. There's no question about it. And study after study has shown, ad infinitum, hundreds of studies have shown that in all of these instances, the state complicity is considerable. Sometimes it's the paramount factor. Okay? But we're beginning now here with the aftermath. We have to go back 400 years. We have to go back 400 years because the first question that we have to consider is, who are the Sikhs? Okay? And Sikhism is a religion that is particular to India. When I say particular to India, I don't mean that there are no Sikhs elsewhere in the world, but of course these are people who have migrated in recent years. There is a Sikh diaspora. In fact, very often they say that, well, there are two things that you can find in any part of the world. Doesn't matter whether it's the Antarctica or Sudan or India or the United States. One is a potato, different ways to eat it and cook it, of course. A potato, and the other is a Sikh. And eminently diasporic people travel widely, okay, and have established pockets of their community in virtually every country that you can think about. Virtually every country. Right? So the Sikhs are a people who arise in India, and their founder is a man known as Guru Nanak, so his name is written over there. And in order to understand Guru Nanak's teachings, all you have to think about is that, so we're talking about the mid-15th century, 1460s, that the predominant religions are Hinduism and Islam. And Guru Nanak is trying to find some kind of commonality, a common path. And of course what happens with religions when they become institutionalized is they become encrusted in a set of practices. So for those of you who know the history of Christianity, I mean, that was what the Protestant Reformation was about. The Protestant Reformation was to liberate, as it were, the real teachings of Christ, if I may use my own way of interpreting it. The Protestant Reformation was an attempt to liberate the teachings of Christ from the Catholic Church. Right? Because Christianity had become deeply institutionalized and had become deeply associated with centers of power. So Guru Nanak is an itinerant preacher, teacher, and what he's trying to do is he's trying to find something that is going to be a bridge between what you might call, I mean, that's one way to describe it, but some kind of bridge between Hinduism and Islam. The Sikhs, so he becomes known as the founder of a new religion, which is a monotheistic faith. So it shares something in common with Islam, but many of its religious practices, many of the texts, many of the verses that you find in the major religious book of the Sikhs, which is called the Adi Granth Sahib. And you don't need to worry about all of that history. This is important for you to understand the context of what happens in 1984. Okay? So you're not going to get tested on something like the Adi Granth Sahib, what that is. But that's a holy book. So many of the verses that you find in this book, for example, are verses drawn from Hindu texts as well. So Guru Nanak is going to be succeeded by 10 other gurus. So here you see this is a popular wall print. There are lots of posters like these that you find all over the Punjab, because the Punjab is a state in northern India close to Delhi, which has been the historic homeland of the Sikhs. So this is a representation of the 10 gurus of the faith. Guru means teacher. I'm sure you're familiar with the word guru because it's used widely in English today. For example, management gurus. You've heard that phrase, management gurus, sex gurus, you name it. They're gurus for everything, right? So the word guru means teacher, okay? So these are the 10 gurus, and what you see here is the Golden Temple, which is the most sacred site of the Sikhs in the state that is called Punjab, right? Now, the 10th Guru, his name is Guru Gobind Singh. And Gobind Singh is going to try to institutionalize the faith. Let me go back to, so Guru Gobind Singh, he's going to try to institutionalize the faith. And when I say institutionalize the faith, what I mean by that is that he wants to actually secure the faith on a permanent footing. He wants to give it certain characteristic features. And there has to be a way in which you can initiate people into the faith. Okay? Many Sikhs themselves, by the way, believe that one of the ways in which they get initiated into the faith is by eventually putting on a turban. Well, the turban, in fact, is a late colonial invention. But what is important is that Guru Gobind Singh is going to try to create this brotherhood. That is what the word Khalsa in the second sentence over there refers to. Khalsa means the pure, the brotherhood of the pure. So these are people who are dedicated to the faith. And eventually there are going to be certain ways in which you can recognize a Sikh apart from a Hindu or a Muslim. So one of the ways in which you recognize a Sikh apart from a Hindu or a Muslim is that the Sikh male is not supposed to cut his hair. And one of the reasons why they wear a turban, which is, as I said, a late colonial invention, is that you don't cut your hair. So you roll up your hair inside and then you put a turban to contain the hair, to make it manageable. So some of these ways in which a Sikh identity is going to be formed, these go back to the 18th century. Why was Guru Gobind Singh, I'm going to conclude with my remarks about Guru Gobind Singh for today. Why was Guru Gobind Singh so interested in initiating the Khalsa? Okay, he was interested in it because there is a problem that is going to arise in the 18th century, in the 17th century, a problem that continues down to the present day. And you have to understand that problem if you're going to understand the nature of this conflict between Sikhs and Hindus in the 1970s and 1980s, leading eventually to the assassination of Mrs. Indira Gandhi. That problem is that there is always a tendency for the Sikh, according to some points of view, to relapse back into Hinduism. Because where does the Sikh come out of? Comes out of Hinduism. That's the predominant religion. That's the predominant religion. Now, in the 17th century, going into the early part of the 18th century, the Sikhs are going to be martyred at the hands of the Muslim rulers. So there's a long history, if I may put it this way, of some animosity on account of the persecution of the Sikhs by the Muslims. And why was there persecution by the Muslim rulers of the Sikhs? The answer is very simple. The answer is that Sikhism is a monotheistic faith. So for the first time, the Muslim rulers of India found that they had a rival in a monotheistic faith, because Hinduism is not a monotheistic faith, as I've tried to suggest to you before. So the Sikh gurus, for example, the 5th Guru Arjan Dev and then the 9th Guru, Guru Tegh Bahadur, they are brought before the Muslim ruler, the Mughal emperor, and they're told, convert to Islam. They refuse to do so, they're killed. They're martyred. Now when you are being persecuted, your tendency is to do what? You want to be able to escape the persecution. One of the ways in which the Sikhs escaped the persecution by the Muslim was they went back into Hinduism. They went back into Hinduism because the Hindus are a massive group of people, a massive majority. So there's more safety. You become part of the anonymous group. If you're a Sikh, you're distinct. Okay, so this is a problem that I want you to think about, and I'm concluding with that the Sikh had a tendency to relapse back into Hinduism. Okay, and we're going to continue with that story, taking us to 1984. And for my next lecture, I also want to be certain that you have read the book, or at least portions of the book, which is that selection, a short anthology of Dalit writing. And I mentioned to you that it's got 4 modules or 4 parts. Try to read at least 2 parts. It's a fantastic work. Okay, so try to read at least 2 parts if you can out of the 4, possibly all 4 if you can.